The 12th century. 10 mind-blowing facts about the century that invented everything we think is medieval. The 11th century ended with a bang. Literally. Crusader armies had conquered Jerusalem. Norman knights ruled from England to Sicily. And the Seljuk Turks had carved up the Middle East like a Thanksgiving turkey. Medieval Europe had discovered that conquest was profitable, expansion was addictive, and nobody was going to stop them from redesigning the world map. But here's the thing about medieval overachievers. They never knew when to quit. The 12th century looked at all that conquest and political upheaval and said, "Cute, but watch us invent intellectual revolution, architectural impossibilities, and romantic literature, while simultaneously fighting the most famous wars in human history." This wasn't just another century of political change. This was the century that created everything we think of as quintessentially medieval. Knights in shining armor? 12th century invention. Gothic cathedrals that seem to defy gravity? 12th century innovation. Universities where scholars debate theology and philosophy? 12th century creation. The idea that romantic love could drive men to heroic deeds? 12th century literary invention. By 1200, medieval Europe had not only conquered vast territories, but had also invented the cultural and intellectual framework that would define European civilization for the next 3 centuries. The rough warriors of 1100 had somehow transformed into the sophisticated society that produced Thomas Aquinas, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and Chartres Cathedral. Welcome to the 12th century, when medieval civilization decided that political conquest was just the warm-up act for cultural revolution. Here are 10 mind-blowing facts about the century that invented everything we think is medieval. Fact number 1. The Crusades became a multinational medieval industry. The success of the First Crusade convinced medieval Europe that holy war was not only spiritually rewarding, but incredibly profitable, turning religious warfare into a permanent fixture of European foreign policy that lasted for 2 centuries. The Second Crusade, 1147 to 1149, was medieval Europe's first experience with crusading failure, and the response was typically medieval. They decided the problem wasn't with the concept, but with the execution. The loss of Edessa prompted the most sophisticated military mobilization in medieval history, led by the King of France and the Holy Roman Emperor. The Third Crusade, 1189 to 1192, transformed crusading from religious pilgrimage into international diplomacy. Richard the Lionheart, Philip Augustus, and Frederick Barbarossa turned the reconquest of Jerusalem into a competition between European monarchies that had more to do with royal prestige than religious devotion. What made 12th century crusading so remarkable was its institutionalization. The military orders, Templars, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights created permanent organizations dedicated to holy warfare. These weren't temporary military expeditions, but standing armies with their own financial resources, political territories, and international authority. The economic impact of crusading transformed European society. Italian merchants financed crusading expeditions in exchange for commercial privileges. French nobles mortgaged their estates to fund their participation. English kings taxed their subjects to support crusading activities they never intended to join personally. The cultural exchange produced by crusading was as significant as the military campaigns. European crusaders encountered Islamic science, philosophy, and technology that revolutionized European intellectual life. Arabic numerals, advanced medicine, and sophisticated philosophy entered European culture through crusading contact. The political consequences of crusading were equally transformative. European monarchies developed new forms of taxation, military organization, and diplomatic relationships to support permanent warfare in distant territories. Most importantly, 12th century crusading established the principle that religious authority could justify unlimited political expansion, creating ideological frameworks that would influence European politics for centuries. Fact number 2. Gothic architecture decided to ignore the laws of physics. Gothic cathedral builders of the 12th century developed architectural techniques that seemed to make stone buildings float in the air while creating interior spaces that made visitors feel like they were standing inside heaven itself. The Gothic Revolution began at the Abbey of Saint-Denis, 1140 to 1144, where Abbot Suger decided that traditional Romanesque architecture was too heavy, too dark, and insufficiently glorious for proper Christian worship. His solution was to redesign the fundamental principles of stone construction. The technical innovations of Gothic architecture were revolutionary. Pointed arches distributed weight more efficiently than rounded arches. Flying buttresses transferred structural loads to external supports, allowing walls to become windows. Ribbed vaulting created structural frameworks that could support impossible spans. The aesthetic achievements were equally remarkable. Gothic cathedrals used light as a building material, creating interior spaces that seemed to glow with divine radiance. Stained glass windows transformed sunlight into theological instruction, while vertical proportions drew the eye upward toward heaven. The construction of Gothic cathedrals became community enterprises that consumed entire cities' resources for generations. Notre Dame de Paris, begun 1163, required 2 centuries to complete. Chartres Cathedral, begun 1194, employed hundreds of craftsmen and required contributions from every social class. The engineering challenges of Gothic construction pushed medieval technology to its limits. Cathedral builders developed sophisticated mathematical knowledge, advanced metalworking techniques, and complex organizational systems to coordinate construction projects that lasted longer than human lifetimes. The social impact of cathedral construction was transformative. Gothic cathedrals became centers of urban development, economic activity, and cultural life that made medieval cities into complex societies rather than simple agricultural settlements. Gothic architecture spread throughout Europe, creating a visual language that unified medieval Christianity while allowing regional variations that reflected local traditions and resources. By 1200, Gothic cathedrals had become the most technologically advanced structures in human history, demonstrating that medieval civilization could create beauty that rivaled any achievement of classical antiquity. Fact number 3. Universities invented intellectual freedom by accident. The 12th century created the first universities in human history, and in the process accidentally established the principle that scholars should be free to pursue knowledge even when it contradicted religious or political authority. The University of Bologna, founded circa 1088, began as a school for legal studies, but quickly evolved into something unprecedented, an institution where scholars from across Europe gathered to debate, dispute, and develop new forms of knowledge. The university model spread to Paris, Oxford, and dozens of other cities within a century. The intellectual revolution centered on the rediscovery of Aristotelian philosophy through Arabic translations and commentaries. European scholars suddenly had access to sophisticated philosophical systems that challenged traditional Christian theology and forced fundamental questions about the relationship between reason and faith. The development of scholastic method transformed European intellectual life Scholars like Peter Abelard developed systematic approaches to resolving contradictions between different authorities, creating intellectual frameworks that could accommodate multiple perspectives while maintaining logical consistency. The university curriculum standardized European education around 7 liberal arts: grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. This created a shared intellectual culture that transcended national boundaries and linguistic differences. The social impact of universities was revolutionary. For the first time in European history, intellectual achievement could provide social mobility independent of birth or military service. University graduates became administrators, diplomats, and advisors who influenced political decisions throughout Europe. The legal innovations of university scholars transformed European governance. Canon law, civil law, and customary law were systematized into coherent legal systems that provided foundations for modern European jurisprudence. The theological achievements of university scholars were equally significant. Scholars like Thomas Aquinas developed systematic theologies that reconciled Aristotelian philosophy with Christian doctrine, creating intellectual frameworks that influenced Christian thought for centuries. Universities established the principle of academic freedom by claiming special privileges that protected scholars from political and religious interference. These claims were often disputed, but the precedent of intellectual autonomy became a permanent feature of European culture. Fact number 4. Eleanor of Aquitaine invented female political power. Eleanor of Aquitaine, circa 1122-1204, demonstrated that medieval women could exercise political authority, cultural influence, and personal autonomy in ways that redefined the possibilities of female power in medieval society. Eleanor's inheritance of Aquitaine made her the wealthiest landholder in France, controlling territories larger than the royal domain. Her marriage to Louis VII, 1137, made her Queen of France, but her divorce, 1152, and immediate remarriage to Henry Plantagenet demonstrated unprecedented female agency in medieval politics. As Queen of England, 1154 to 1189, Eleanor exercised political authority that rivaled her husband's power. She governed England during Henry's absences, conducted diplomatic negotiations with foreign powers, and managed territorial disputes throughout the Angevin Empire. Eleanor's patronage of troubadour poetry and courtly literature created new forms of cultural expression that celebrated romantic love, female beauty, and aristocratic refinement. The court of love tradition transformed European literature and established aesthetic standards that influenced European culture for centuries. The political crisis following Henry II's death, 1189, demonstrated Eleanor's continuing influence. At age 67, she managed the succession crisis, negotiated Richard I's ransom from captivity, and prevented the collapse of the Angevin Empire through diplomatic skill and political determination. Eleanor's relationship with her sons, particularly Richard I and John, showed how medieval women could exercise political power through family networks while maintaining personal autonomy. Her ability to alternately support and oppose her sons' policies demonstrated sophisticated political judgment. The legal and administrative innovations of Eleanor's courts established precedents for female authority that influenced European politics for centuries. Her example proved that women could exercise sovereign power effectively when given institutional support. Eleanor's longevity allowed her to influence 3 generations of European politics, demonstrating that female political power could be sustained over time through institutional position rather than temporary personal relationships. Eleanor's cultural legacy was as significant as her political achievements. Her patronage of literature, architecture, and artistic expression created cultural standards that defined aristocratic society throughout medieval Europe. Fact number 5. The Angevin Empire almost united Western Europe. The Angevin Empire, created through Henry II's marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, controlled territories stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees and came closer to unifying Western Europe than any power since Charlemagne. Henry II's territorial holdings included England, Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, Poitou, Aquitaine, and Gascony, making him the most powerful ruler in Western Europe, despite being technically a vassal of the French king for his continental territories. The administrative innovations of the Angevin Empire created governmental systems that could manage territories with different languages, legal traditions, and cultural practices. Henry's itinerant court traveled constantly between England and France, maintaining personal control over distant territories. The legal reforms of Henry II revolutionized English governance through innovations like trial by jury, systematic record-keeping, and standardized legal procedures. The Angevin legal system became a model for European jurisprudence and established principles that influenced English law for centuries. The conflict with Thomas Becket, 1162 to 1170, demonstrated the tensions between royal authority and church independence that defined medieval politics. Becket's murder became a symbol of religious martyrdom that enhanced papal authority while damaging royal prestige. The military innovations of the Angevin Empire included professional armies, standardized equipment, and sophisticated siege techniques that made traditional feudal military service obsolete. Angevin military organization influenced European warfare for centuries. The economic integration of Angevin territories created trade networks that connected England with continental markets, establishing commercial relationships that survived the empire's political fragmentation. The cultural achievements of the Angevin court included patronage of literature, music, and architecture that established artistic standards throughout Western Europe. The Angevin court became a center of cultural innovation that influenced European aristocratic society. The succession crisis following Henry II's death led to conflicts between Richard I, John, and Philip Augustus that ultimately destroyed Angevin unity, but established patterns of international relations that defined European politics for centuries. Fact number 6. Saladin became medieval Europe's most respected enemy. Saladin's reconquest of Jerusalem, 1187, and his conduct during the Third Crusade earned him recognition as the most chivalrous ruler of his era, forcing European Christians to acknowledge Islamic military and moral superiority. Saladin's rise to power demonstrated Islamic political recovery from the fragmentation that had enabled Crusader success. His unification of Egypt and Syria created military resources that could challenge Crusader territories while maintaining diplomatic relationships with European powers. The Battle of Hattin, 1187, was one of the most decisive military victories in medieval history, eliminating Crusader military power in a single engagement and opening Jerusalem to Islamic reconquest. Saladin's treatment of captured Crusaders demonstrated medieval Islamic concepts of honorable warfare. Saladin's recapture of Jerusalem was conducted with unprecedented magnanimity. Unlike the Crusader conquest, 1099, which had massacred the city's population, Saladin's conquest protected civilian lives and allowed Christian pilgrimage to continue. The European response to Saladin's success, the Third Crusade, became a personal conflict between Saladin and Richard I that transformed military campaign into chivalric competition. Their mutual respect established standards of knightly conduct that influenced European military culture. Saladin's diplomatic skills were as impressive as his military achievements. He negotiated treaties with Byzantine Empire, maintained relationships with Italian merchants, and corresponded with European monarchs as an equal. The cultural impact of Saladin's reputation in Europe was remarkable. Christian writers praised his virtue, Muslim authors celebrated his piety, and later, European literature made him a symbol of ideal kingship. Saladin's administrative achievements created governmental systems that balanced Islamic religious authority with practical political needs. His legal reforms, economic policies, and cultural patronage established standards for Islamic governance. Saladin's legacy influenced both Islamic and Christian concepts of legitimate authority, demonstrating that political power could be exercised ethically, regardless of religious differences. Fact number 7. The Reconquista became Spain's national project. The Christian reconquest of Islamic Spain transformed from sporadic frontier warfare into systematic territorial expansion that created distinctive Spanish kingdoms and established patterns of religious conflict that would influence Spanish culture for centuries. Alfonso VI of Castile's conquest of Toledo, 1085, marked the beginning of systematic Christian expansion into Islamic territories. The capture of Spain's former capital demonstrated that Islamic Al-Andalus was vulnerable to coordinated Christian military pressure. The emergence of the Almoravids, and later the Almohads, showed Islamic Spain's continued capacity for military resistance, but also demonstrated that North African intervention was necessary to maintain Islamic authority in the peninsula. The development of the military orders in Spain, particularly Santiago, Calatrava, and Alcántara, created permanent institutions dedicated to frontier warfare. These organizations combined religious motivation with military expertise to create forces specifically designed for reconquest. The Reconquista established distinctive forms of Spanish kingship that combined Christian religious authority with frontier military leadership. Spanish kings became symbols of religious warfare in ways that influenced Spanish political culture for centuries. The settlement patterns established during the Reconquista created Spanish social structures that balanced Christian, Islamic, and Jewish populations. The convivencia, coexistence, that emerged in conquered territories became a distinctive feature of medieval Spanish civilization. The cultural achievements of Reconquista Spain included architectural innovations that combined Christian, Islamic, and Jewish artistic traditions. The mudéjar style became a distinctively Spanish form of artistic expression. The economic impact of the Reconquista transformed Spanish society from frontier warfare to territorial governance. The wealth captured from Islamic territories financed further expansion while creating economic relationships that connected Spain with Mediterranean trade networks. The international significance of the Reconquista attracted military participation from throughout Europe, making Spanish reconquest a pan-European project that influenced medieval concepts of religious warfare. Fact number 8. The Second Crusade proved that failure could be more influential than success. The catastrophic failure of the Second Crusade, 1147 to 1149, transformed European understanding of crusading from guaranteed religious success to complex international enterprise that required sophisticated planning and realistic expectations. The mobilization for the Second Crusade was the most impressive military organization in medieval European history. The participation of Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany represented unprecedented cooperation between European monarchies for religious objectives. The military disasters of the Second Crusade, the destruction of Conrad's army in Anatolia, and Louis's defeats in Asia Minor, demonstrated that European military superiority was not guaranteed, and that Islamic resistance had become more sophisticated and effective. The recriminations following the Second Crusade's failure produced the first systematic analysis of crusading strategy, logistics, and objectives. European leaders recognized that future crusading required better planning, more realistic goals, and superior military organization. The theological questions raised by crusading failure challenged medieval concepts of divine intervention in human affairs. The failure of such a religiously motivated enterprise forced European intellectuals to develop more sophisticated understanding of the relationship between faith and political success. The financial consequences of the Second Crusade revolutionized European taxation and military organization. The enormous costs of failed expedition convinced European monarchs that crusading required permanent institutional support rather than temporary mobilization. The diplomatic lessons of the Second Crusade included recognition that European success in the Middle East required understanding of local politics, Islamic military systems, and Byzantine imperial objectives. The cultural impact of the Second Crusade's failure included literary works that questioned crusading assumptions while maintaining commitment to religious warfare as a legitimate Christian enterprise. The long-term consequences of the Second Crusade established patterns of international cooperation and conflict that influenced European politics throughout the medieval period. Fact number 9. Henry II's legal reforms created the foundation of English law. Henry II's judicial innovations established legal principles and governmental institutions that survived for centuries and influenced the development of legal systems throughout the English-speaking world. The Constitutions of Clarendon, 1164, systematized English legal procedures and established royal authority over ecclesiastical courts. These reforms created unified legal systems that could function throughout Henry's territories while maintaining local legal traditions. The development of common law created standardized legal procedures that could be applied consistently throughout England. Royal judges traveling on circuit established legal precedents that became binding throughout the kingdom. The innovation of trial by jury revolutionized European legal systems by replacing trial by ordeal with systematic evaluation of evidence by local communities. This legal innovation spread throughout Europe and became a fundamental principle of Western jurisprudence. The establishment of royal courts created institutional alternatives to feudal and ecclesiastical justice that provided legal remedies for social classes previously excluded from formal legal protection. The systematic record-keeping of Henry's administration created documentary evidence for legal decisions that could be referenced in future cases, establishing the principle of legal precedent that became fundamental to English law. The legal education provided by Henry's courts created professional classes of lawyers, judges, and administrators who could maintain complex legal systems across multiple generations. The integration of Roman law, canon law, and customary law created synthetic legal systems that could accommodate diverse legal traditions while maintaining practical functionality. Henry's legal innovations influenced European legal development for centuries and established principles that became fundamental to Western concepts of justice, individual rights, and governmental authority. Fact number 10. The 12th century invented the idea that culture could be as important as conquest. The most mind-blowing fact about the 12th century is that it demonstrated medieval civilization's capacity to create cultural achievements that were as influential and lasting as military conquests. The intellectual achievements of the 12th century, universities, scholastic philosophy, legal systems, and theological innovations, created frameworks for European thought that influenced Western civilization for centuries after the political structures of the period had disappeared. The artistic achievements, Gothic architecture, courtly literature, and musical innovations, established aesthetic standards that defined European culture throughout the medieval period and influenced European artistic development for centuries. The social innovations, concepts of romantic love, chivalric ideals, and aristocratic refinement, created cultural patterns that influenced European society far beyond their medieval origins. The 12th century established the principle that cultural achievement could provide lasting influence that exceeded the temporary impact of political or military success. Universities outlasted the kingdoms that founded them. Gothic cathedrals survived the dynasties that built them, and literary works influenced societies that had forgotten their political contexts. The integration of military conquest with cultural development created a distinctive medieval synthesis that balanced political power with intellectual achievement, territorial expansion with artistic innovation, and religious authority with cultural sophistication. Most importantly, the 12th century proved that medieval civilization had matured beyond simple political and military competition to become a complex cultural system capable of creating lasting contributions to human civilization. By 1200, medieval Europe had established cultural institutions and intellectual frameworks that would define European civilization throughout the medieval period and influence Western development for centuries afterward. The rough warriors of 1100 had become the sophisticated society that could produce both military conquest and cultural revolution simultaneously.